Very excited to be here, and some of the things I was going to say have already been said, so I'll see how I can make that work in my own presentation. It has a clear focus in the title, but you might notice that I tend to be a bit scattered in my areas of interest, and that's because my own career has been kind of all over the place. I started with a BA in, I wanted to do a BA in English literature, but then I found linguistics and stylistics especially far more interesting, so I finished my BA in English linguistics, then did an MA in translation studies, focusing primarily on the use of tools, but writing a thesis on retranslations of The Great Gatsby, so a very literary topic. And then I went on to do a PhD in metaphor studies and wrote a PhD thesis on metaphor in fiction, which had nothing to do with translation. But then I became an assistant professor in translation studies. So I've been trying to bring all of that background back together, focusing on the translation of style, especially in fiction, often focusing on gender. And the translation of metaphor across disciplines. And some of my examples were not from literature, and I've checked, and everything should be literary now. But since most of my work has not been exclusively on metaphor in literature, some of the examples might have crept in from news texts or political discourse. But they're interesting as a comparison anyway. Since we've just had lunch, and there's always the danger of falling asleep right after lunch, I thought we'd start by interacting with each other. I would like to start by making somewhat more explicit our own intuitions about what do translations behave like, how do we recognize translations, how do we recognize them as being different from originals, and how do we recognize literature from being different from other types of discourse, other domains or genres? So here you have two texts in English. I would like you to have a look, see if anything jumps out at you as striking you as particularly literary. So what cues do you have that this is literature? And are there any cues that tell you this is translated literature, not original writing?
Machine translated or human translated?
I'm not going to tell you yet.
Nice try, Chris.
So just read them, and does anything jump out at you that you think, oh, this must be a student translator, or no, this is a professional literary translator, or this is Google Translate, must be. Do you have any?
I think the second one's the translation.
The second one is the translation, the bottom one? Why do you think that one is a...
I feel like the first one is more natural, something running at 8:30, you can walk up, it's like Dennis term. The second one is just like putting sentences together.
Okay.
Organizing the words to make it more reasonable.
So the first one, the top one, strikes you as more natural?
Yeah.
Yeah?
There's dry as cork, so there's dry language is more simplistic than dry as cork. So yes, I would say that the first sounds more natural, but it might be just English translation.
It feels like maybe in the first one as well, there's been more effort to make the tenses work in English, whereas in the second one, it might be it's been translated quite directly from the tenses that we used in the language. So it doesn't quite, it makes sense, but it's not quite.
Is there a particular one that you think...
Towards the end.
Towards the end? And then thought it was Sunday?
Yeah, that feels a bit kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite as intuitively correct in English. To me anyway.
Yeah?
And focus on the subject as well in the beginning of both sentences. Sunday morning, he, and the second sentence, he first, instead of just the first one, the first thing he remembered, the order, telling a story.
A more natural word order. Okay, good. Yeah?
I'm a bit puzzled by the two commas between before and after to rest.
To rest.
Which to me sounds a bit unidiomatic, but then again, it could be just a writer's particular style.
So those two commas around to rest, does that strike you as something a professional human translator would do, or something Google would do?
I don't know, it's really hard to say, isn't it? I don't know, it's hard to say.
Hard to say?
I just...
Do others have other intuitions?
I read them both as human translations.
Both as human translations?
The first is human.
First is human?
I think the second
So
is
maybe we
human,
should do
but
a
more
hands up.
simplified.
Who thinks both of them are a human translation? Oh, only a few. Top one is human, bottom one is a machine. Yeah? And both of them by machines? Okay, so we're pretty convinced that the top one is human. Do you have any intuitions about whether it's a professional or a student translator? I tend to put the students in the human category.
I thought actually the top one was machine because there are two strange things in the first sentence.
Yes?
It may be also a difference, possible difference between US and UK English.
Okay.
But I would have thought in UK English would say on Sunday morning rather than just Sunday morning.
Yes?
And would put 8:30 first.
Yes?
The other thing that stood out for me was after mouth, we would often put as dry rather than just leave it. Which
A mouth
felt to
dry
be a
as
bit
cork.
clunky, and possibly machine general.
Okay.
I would,
Yeah.
after the first one, after then, I would put he myself. First thing he remembered because I was looking at
Then he realized. Yes.
But I think either a machine or a human could get that one.
Okay. All right, so we'll return to these fragments later on, after we've seen some more of what machines and humans do. The reason why I put this in my classes is because the students tend to think that literary language is a different language from normal language. And we use, especially the work by Biber and his colleagues, but also Carter and Nash, to demonstrate that literary language isn't a different language. It uses the same resources as any language use does, but they tend to pattern in different ways. So most of us recognize fiction, as opposed to, for instance, news or academic discourse, because the pronouns tend to be different. So when you speak, you use I and you and we, but when you write, most authors use he and she and they, so they use third-person pronouns rather than first. And most authors use past tenses in fiction rather than present tenses. And of course, authors experiment with these expectations. It's very jarring to read novels like Bright Lights, Big City in the you form. It's a very strange novel to read. The entire novel is you, and at some point you become a little bit intimidated because you think, this is not about me, this is about you. So it should be in the I, not the you. But those kinds of linguistic cues tell us that something is more likely to be literary than non-literary. And we also try to convince them that even though literary translators feel that they're doing something different from non-literary translators, there are in fact many types of commercial translation that are highly creative and that face the same problems that literary translators do. Think of marketing text and particular kinds of websites and advertising. So it's not that if machine translation doesn't work for literary translation, the problem's solved. Those commercial kinds of translation also have to deal with the same kinds of problem. And if, at some point, machine translation solves their problems, that would mean it might potentially also solve literary problems. It's not a specifically literary problem. It has to do with language creativity. But that's not unique to literature. So another round of questions. Who in this room thinks that translating metaphor is difficult?
Depends on the metaphor.
Depends on the metaphor. Very good answer. So there's a kind of general assumption in the literature that translating metaphor is difficult. Whole books have been devoted to the translation of metaphor, as if it's something that deserves unique attention. Do you think it's different from other kinds of translation problems, say cultural references or humor or politeness?
Also, in some some respects, yeah.
In some respects? Can you think of some of those respects?
Like metaphor, it's just metaphor can draw on various aspects of life. So it's not just like culturally bonded or it is like a mixture of aspects that it could be like put in can be put in this metaphor. But I'm not specific enough.
So one of the things when we do translation studies at Leiden University, apologies, we look at all those different models that are out there with procedures. So how to handle cultural references, and we do Excela and Grit and Newmark. And then we give them models for dealing with humor, and we give them models for dealing with translation, most particularly Newmark and Schaeffler. And then we ask them, do we need all of these different models? Do we actually need a new model with new procedures for each and every phenomenon? Do we need different procedures to translate metaphor from the procedures we need to translate cultural references? And what does it mean if we actually need different procedures? What does that tell us about how our language and how our mind works? And in relation to machine translation, if we can pinpoint why translating metaphor is different and potentially more difficult, we would be able to help train MT engines how to deal with metaphor. But I think at present we need more context there. Do you think translating metaphor is more difficult for humans or machines?
Machines.
Machines. Why?
Because they have no philosophy of language.
No philosophy of language?
Because language is
So
all
they don't reflect on the meaning of
because
the...
fundamentally
Yeah.
language is all metaphor. You know, a word, I mean, you know, if I create a private language and invent a word, it will be meaningless to you. It only has meaning in the sense that the entire language system is a metaphorical structure that refers to other things.
Okay.
But what does difficulty mean to a machine?
Exactly.
How can a machine experience difficulty?
Yes.
You know, in the same way as human has.
Yes.
Which, yeah, that's a question for another day.
So one of the things I thought, based on my own corpus research of metaphor, was that translating metaphor should be easier for a machine than for humans, because they can simply gather millions and millions and millions of texts and see how metaphors have been translated, and then extrapolate, this is the most likely translation of this metaphor. Whereas students have to really, they often think that metaphors are novel and creative and original, especially in news text, especially translating English news into Dutch. And then you get really strange translations that are Dutch news text, but they read like poems. They have too many creative metaphor in them, because the students fail to recognize that, for instance, sparking a riot is so conventional in English news discourse that they shouldn't transfer the metaphor directly into Dutch, where we don't use that fire metaphor. We just say led to riots. But they transfer it directly because they think, wow, spark a riot, that sounds amazing. And then they say, deed onlusten uiteenspatten. And the Dutch reader of the text would find it really awkward to see that expression. Whereas a machine translation engine, based on, for instance, the Europar corpus, which has lots of sparking metaphors in it, should simply deduct, okay, if I translate this from English into Dutch, I should get rid of it, and should just naturalize it to something that means led to or caused. So I personally expected metaphors to be easier for machines than humans, because they have this huge pile of data to search through. And that's also why we always teach our students to use AndConc and Sketch Engine to deal with such translations, particularly for metaphor. We tell them, go to the Europar corpus and look up the metaphors and see what professional translators have done with those metaphors. And their conclusion almost always is, oh, they got rid of them. In this kind of political discourse, the English use them, but the Dutch don't, or the British, I shouldn't say English. The British use them, the Dutch don't. Okay, so Google. this is where I find my students respond differently from the professional translators I work with. Professional literary translators hate Google Translate. They don't want to use it. My students think it's awesome. I had an email from a student last week. They had to do a literary machine translation project for the course. And one of them said, I really want to put all of Dickens' work through machine translation. Can I do that? Go ahead. Why not? So I think it's interesting, and that relates to your work, to see how this develops for a new generation of translators who are so used to working with these tools that they don't see why not. Even for literary texts. They see it as this huge resource that they can tap into, and they can use it as they want. They're still in control. Nobody's forcing them to do anything, so they think, why not? I'll just see what Google Translate does. So this I don't have to go through because we did this morning. The history from rule-based to statistical to neural machine translation. But I think in terms of metaphor research, what is interesting to me is that I would predict that if you can somehow have a module in the machine translation engine that remembers fixed phrases, for instance idioms and proverbs, it should be better at translating metaphor. Because most idiomatic expressions are metaphorical. And one of the questions I had was, will a neural system that incorporates no linguistic knowledge treat those metaphorical idioms as single words and then get them wrong? So based on my very, very limited knowledge of machine translation, I thought, translating metaphor may actually be more difficult for the really conventional cliché ones that human translators immediately recognize. Let the cat out of the bag. Oh, the wheels are in motion. Oh, don't let my career go down the sinkhole. Those should be relatively easy for human translators, but hard for Google, I thought, especially in a neural environment. So this was my PhD research, Metaphor and Discourse. There were actually 4 of us working together on the same project, and each of us got their own register. So I was responsible for fiction. There was also someone working on news, someone working on conversations, and someone working on academic discourse. This is following Biber's 4 main registers. And we sampled 4 times 50,000 words from the British National Corpus. And I should have put a link to the corpus because all of our annotations are available through the Oxford Text Archives, the OTA. So if you Google VU Amsterdam Metaphor Corpus, you can download the entire corpus which has been tagged for metaphor. And we have colleagues in Brazil who are trying to teach computer programs to use that data to do automatic metaphor recognition. Because you can see from the corpus, okay, this word has always been marked or coded or annotated as metaphor when it occurs in this context. So it can extrapolate from the context. If I see this word in this context, it's always a metaphor. So that's what they're trying to do there.
And it was a manual annotation.
Sorry?
It was manual annotation.
Our work was manual, yes. And they're trying to feed that into a deep learning program and make it do the metaphor annotations automatically, which would be awesome if it could do that. That would save so much time. And then we did a cross-register comparison, and our expectation, of course, was literature should have the most metaphor, because it's literature. But it didn't. Academic text had the most metaphor, which actually makes sense because the topic of academic text is usually expressed through metaphor. So we had text about the flow of electricity, fields of electricity, and all kinds of topics that are necessarily embedded in metaphor. And so the number of metaphors go up. They're all conventional. And if you talk to academics, they say, no, but that's not metaphor, not anymore. We invented that metaphor thousands of years ago. But we took a broad language approach. So all of that conventional metaphor was also tagged as being metaphorical. Same for news text, had a lot of metaphor related to the topics that are discussed in news text, whereas fiction is mostly grounded in literal people going to literal places and handling literal objects, and then you get nice flourishes of metaphor in between, which strike your attention, which catch your attention, and then you think, oh, there's a lot of metaphor in this text. Because the ones in literature, in fiction, actually are more likely to catch your attention. And I'll put a link into Gudrun Reiniers's work, who redid the entire analysis for all 4 genres, or registers, I should say, checking each and every one of our metaphors for whether it was deliberate, so used as a creative metaphor, or not. And I think they're going to make that available through the Oxford Text Archives as well. So you can then see which of those metaphors are actually used as metaphor and which are not. And her analysis confirmed that the metaphors in fiction are fewer but more deliberate. And that's why people experience literature as being more metaphorical. Because the ones that are in there are more likely to draw your attention to the fact that they are metaphors. But most of the metaphors I had in my corpus were actually quite conventional. So he was angry and bitter. Oh, I have such a heavy burden. I have such a long way to go. It was a golden morning. Golden and pale were the most frequent keywords in my corpus. They sound poetic, but they're actually quite cliché. So I thought, okay, if most of the metaphors in fiction are actually that conventional, and you would all be able to use them in other types of discourse as well, then the machine translation engine should not have any problems with them. It should still be able to find them, even if I don't train it on literary language. It should still know the translation for bitter here should be something emotional, and not having to do with taste. I wanted to do a search here for those metaphors, but I think we'll see how we go for time and see how. I wanted to put them through Google and see how they work for all of your languages, but we'll see if we can do that later. So metaphor and translation studies, there seem to be 2 strands, though the first strand is dying out. The translatability of metaphor. Is it possible to translate metaphor? Most of this work has now been abandoned, except in philosophy, where this is still a genuine question. But most empirical studies, most corpus-based studies, think, well, the answer is obviously yes, because we translate metaphor every day. So there is no yes-no question. So they focus on techniques for translating metaphor, and those can be either linguistically oriented, like Newmark's work. So what do you do with the linguistic expression? Or like Schaeffner, who focuses on the conceptual metaphor side. So how do these different linguistic metaphors relate to underlying patterns of conceptual metaphor? I don't know how many of you are familiar with these. The students find these really helpful, but when they analyze their data, they say most of these never occur. So this is assumed to be the translator's toolkit for metaphor translation, but actually what most translators do is either 1 or 2. So it either works in both languages and you keep it, or it doesn't work in the target language and then you adapt it. So it's raining cats and dogs is replaced by an idiom that has the same meaning but a different image. And all of the other ones, they said, we don't see this happening. But I think, was it you, Dorothy, who said it's a traditional switch from metaphor to simile?
It's one that comes up in the literature all the
Yes.
time, and you do
Yeah.
see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You do see it sometimes.
It's
Most translators
Yeah.
that I looked at, if it's original metaphor in the source language, it's original metaphor, but the same as the source language in the target.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've had a few theses just going through translations, trying to tag how valuable these steps are to professional translators. do they actually use all of them? And how is that restricted by the genre or by the topic? When delete is redundant, the students always ask, how do I know if it's redundant? How do I know if I can just chuck it out of the text? Who decides whether it's redundant?
Sorry, wasn't that your first example about Spark's controversy? You delete the metaphor because target language.
That's replace it by it's into meaning. So that's technically it's this one. Convert the metaphor into its meaning. So if you delete it, it means there's no trace that there was even a metaphorical word in the text whatsoever.
But
so its meaning is also not translated.
Omission.
Omission, yeah.
Well,
so nothing
that's
remains.
Always the best option.
Nothing remains of its I think Venuti would say that only happens if you translate from a minority language into a powerful language and culture. You get rid of things that don't fit.
I was going to say, doesn't the tendency depend on whether because right now foreignizing translation is more in vogue. You mentioned
yes.
a number of times,
yes.
But in an era when domesticating translation
yes.
was more in vogue, or in a language system where domesticating translation is more in vogue, then that might shift
yes.
which strategies you use.
And one thing I wanted to do is see if you can actually analyze machine translation data in terms of these procedures. The students get a little confused. They say Google decided to, and I say Google doesn't decide anything. It's not, a machine engine doesn't apply procedures the way a human translator does. It predicts the probability that something is the correct translation. It doesn't think, I will replace this metaphor by a simile. It looks at the data and then says, oh, the simile is more common in Dutch. I'll offer you the simile as a translation. And that's really interesting to look at how students formulate those decisions made by Google. But the prediction is, of course, that Google will always do one, but it might do two, depending on what data is in the corpus. But that's something I was trying to find out. Schaeffler's work is less easy to apply, I think. Especially, how do you decide that something is the same overarching metaphor? So she has an example where she says in German it's an umbrella, and in English it's an umbrella, and in German it's a roof. That's the same overarching metaphor. But how do you decide that a roof and an umbrella are the same overarching metaphor? It's very difficult to do for students, that kind of philosophical, analytical restructuring. So we usually don't apply this one.
They both overarch.
Yes, yes, but it's very difficult for people to formulate that kind of overlap between. So how is it the same overlapping metaphor, or different parts of the same metaphor, or different metaphors? So they find that more difficult to do than the Newmark analysis. That's easier.
It's not close to the cognitive shifts, lack of. That metaphors are
Yes,
cognitive.
yes, yes.
So perhaps this is more explicit, Lapov, how he
Yes.
describes.
Yeah,
what metaphor
his
is.
domains are much more specific. So I've been teaching metaphor explicitly in our MA in translation for 3 years now, and what we see is that at first they don't see them. They just don't see them. And then we train them, and they see them. They can pick out almost all of the metaphors in the text, but for most of them they say, I don't actually understand what this means. And then we do another kind of training round, how to analyze metaphor, and then they see them and they understand them, and they can explain quite well in their papers what the metaphors mean, but they still do very strange things, strange from the perspective of the teacher. It makes perfect sense to them. But then they say, why don't you understand what I did? And my colleagues and I have been thinking, is this a language proficiency problem? Is it a genre knowledge problem? So they don't yet have the experience that tells them this is normal in news, but not in academic text. This is normal in academic text, but not in literary translation. Or is it stylistic competence that they lack? So do we need to train them more to do stylistic analysis? So what I've been focusing on is how aware are students of metaphor? which ones and when, and which ones are then difficult to translate and why, and for whom. That's where my machine translation came back in. So, are the same metaphors difficult for humans and machines? If not, then potentially the students could profit from the machines. If the machine can get it right, and you see a metaphor and you think, I have no idea what to do with this metaphor, then one of the aids to the students would be Google Translate it and see what Google does. And you might understand how to translate the metaphor. So here we have some examples, and someone will have to time me because I have lost any sense of time.
We're actually starting 10 minutes later, I think. So
Okay, well just warn me if I need to wrap up. So here are a few examples from the corpus. The light blue is very hard to read on the big screen. The plane lurches into motion, it bounces alarmingly as it gathers speed. The plane climbs reluctantly, one set of wings dipping drunkenly. And this is one of those classic personifications of an object in fiction. And Google does it quite well. The only thing incorrect in the Dutch translation, and we have a Dutch speaker so you can check, the only thing that's really incorrect is that it got confused with dipping drunkenly and just says drunk, drunk. One set of wings, drunk, drunk. So it wasn't able to do anything with dipping. And I noticed in the data that anytime there's an ing form in the English, it gets confused. And it does really strange things in Dutch. But that's not a literary problem. That's a problem that English and Dutch have different ways of constructing verbs, and the ing form exists in English but not in Dutch. So anytime it sees an ing form, it messes up the Dutch. So it's not a literary problem. It had no problems personifying the plane. This one is slightly less personified than the English one. It just says comes. The plane comes into motion. But gathers speed, snelheid verzamelen, is the same metaphor. And then the second one I picked because here everything goes wrong. Why does it go wrong? It doesn't do idioms. So got up Rufus' nose a bit. The translation is so strange I can't translate it. He had Rufus' nose a bit stuck up. And then it went to his head. He went earlier to his head. So anytime it comes across those fixed, metaphorical, conventional expressions, it messes up completely. Even the pronouns, because it says it in English, but it says he in Dutch. And the third one is one of another classic type of metaphor in fiction with people being compared to animals. So she transformed into a leggy young filly from a leggy young filly into a sleekly beautiful racehorse. And Google has the translation entirely correct, except for that it doesn't know how to do adjective endings. So it should be just slank, not slanke, and mooi, not mooie. So again, it's not a literary problem. It directly transfers the metaphor. It just gets the linguistic side wrong. So I thought, wow, this is actually quite good. It gets most of the ones except the idioms right. And then I noticed the curious case of the sentence, and you talked about this too, that it builds the model based on the sentence, and that's why if the sentence is different, the same word it was schriller das Telefon?
Yes, yeah.
Schrillen das Telefon. Because it occurs in a different sentence each time, the translation is different each time. And I took this English sentence and Googled the part, she might shatter him to hell. First I entered, she might shatter him, and the translation was correct. She might destroy him. Then I added by just looking, and it was still correct. She might splinter him just by looking. But as soon as I started adding more to the front and more to the back, and as soon as I added all to hell, Google got completely confused and the translation is completely wrong. And I think this is interesting for the computer side of the story. So why does it get the metaphor right if it's a really short sentence, but it gets the metaphor wrong if it's a long sentence? And if we can somehow fix that, then it becomes really interesting. Because it has the potential to get the metaphor right, but not if it's in a larger sentence. This was interesting in terms of what we already talked about with Venuti and Berman. So human translators have a tendency to destroy patterns because they aim for idiomatic natural fluency. This is Fitzgerald, and when we give these sentences to the students, some of them get rid of all of the ands, because they find it really annoying that Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby says and to excess. There's a reason why he does that, because it mimics the excessiveness of the situation. Now, when they know it's Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, they're more careful. When you don't tell them it's Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, they rewrite it and get rid of all of the ands. And Google doesn't do that. It has no problems just repeating and 3,000 times. So you see here that there's an interesting thing for stylisticians, that those patterns, those deforming tendencies that human translators tend to apply, Google doesn't do that. The only problem it has is the problem you notice, that it can't see repetition if it's in complex sentences. So it has no problem repeating things over and over, but as the sentences change, the translation changes. And that's a problem that I think is interesting for the computational side to solve. How do we train it to recognize repetition through a literary text? And in a way, having students look at Google translated fiction teaches them how to resist those kinds of standardization tendencies that they have. So I also gave them one flow for the cuckoo's nest. I've recently published one paper on this because it was really interesting what happened. In terms of mind style, the narrator expresses his surroundings in terms of ice metaphors throughout the novel. Whenever the big nurse, who is scary and hateful, comes along, Bromden has the sense that everything around him freezes over. And I looked at what the students did with those freeze metaphors, and then I looked at what machine translation did with this. So what I noticed the students did is they deleted, they adapted to a standard idiomatic expression. This means stiffened. Stiffened, he stands there, where he stiffens. So the agency is wrong because it's she freezes him, and here it says where he stiffens. It turns it into a simile, as if frozen. And again, this is still freezing, but the agency is wrong again. She freezes him, he freezes. So I noticed that they did really varying things with those metaphors. But actually, this was really shocking to me. To just delete a metaphor that's part of the mind style of the novel. And they did the same for nailing here. Delete, delete. And I asked them, oh, that's probably my next slide then, wait, motivations. Yes, why did you do that? And these were the motivations they gave me. I couldn't find a translation that would suit the text, so I got rid of it. It doesn't sound very nice, so I just picked it up a different verb. You don't say that in Dutch, so I changed it. I deleted the metaphor and used something else instead. And this, I think, is for teachers a very interesting thing to realize. What do students do and why? And how do we train them not to do this in literary translation? I think for metaphor, you would assume that the author wants the metaphor there and doesn't want a different metaphor there. He or she wants that metaphor there. So the paper I wrote was specifically on this novel and its official translation, because the official translator did the same thing. He got rid of the ice metaphors. So from a linguistic Newmark perspective, it's fine. If you come across a metaphor, you can adapt it with a different metaphor that's idiomatic in your target language. For Schaeffner, it's still fine, because freezing, paralyzing, stopping, and turning to stone are all part of the same kind of solidification metaphor. But I would argue that from a stylistic point of view, it's very strange to do this, because you're changing the mind style of the narrator. And changing the mind style of the narrator means you actually change the experience of the reader. So what did Google do? Well, it did what you would expect it to do. It just kept it.
Translated it.
It looked at the data and thought, there's only one translation here, namely freeze. So I'll just do that. And spijker and nagel are synonyms for nail. So both accurate. I'll go to the last one. So the interesting thing for us here is that the metaphors that are difficult to translate for machines in literature are actually the conventional idiomatic ones that we use all the time. It's not the literary metaphors that are difficult, because they have the simplest procedure. You transfer them directly. So literary metaphor is not hard to translate. Non-literary metaphor is really hard to translate. And I think both humans and machines struggle with idioms and those kinds of conventional metaphors. So we'll go to the one you just had. Here it is. It's Gerard Reven. Does anyone know Gerard Reven? It's one of the most famous post-war, yes, you should know, post-war authors in the Netherlands, and it was recently translated into English. And here we have 3 versions. You've already seen this one, I think, this one, Dry as Cork, and you've seen this one, right? So after what I've just told you, do you stand by your decision? This one is human, this one is machine? You're right. This is DeepL, this is Google, and this is the human translator. The interesting thing is that in terms of if we want in stylistics to mimic the structure of the source text in the target text, something that Venuti and Bermond and Turi would encourage, then the machine translations are superior here, because they've done the least reordering.
Sorry, what's the first one again?
The first one is the human translator.
Okay, and then?
And this is Google.
Yeah.
So Google retains the kind of cork metaphor here.
Yeah.
This one is DeepL. No, sorry, this is DeepL, this is Google, this is human. Dry as cork is the human.
So it's human. The last one.
The last one's human, yes.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
They were reversed on the first slide, sorry.
Okay.
And what you see is in the Dutch, he remembered himself first, comma, that the previous day in the afternoon on bed he had been lying, resting, and realized then, comma, that it was Sunday. And this is possible in English. He remembered first that he had rested in bed the previous day in the afternoon, and then remembered that it was Sunday. So that kind of emphasis on the first, comma, that, then, comma, that in Dutch is only retained by this was Google. So DeepL has kind of normalized the order.
The first one is human?
No, the bottom one is human, yes.
The first
But it got rid of the metaphor, yes, here.
The first one is by whom?
This is the DeepL. DeepL, Google, human, yes. So we recognize this as being literary translation, I think, because the diction is much closer to what we would expect of a literary translation. Awoke with a mouth dry as cork sounds more literary. And that curious part with the commas is something that humans do, interfering with the text. So stylistically, you might argue that Google got it right. But in terms of literariness, I think we all recognize that the human translator was most literary. So there's something to benefit from each side, I think. And the same, do I still have time for one example? This is the Aanslag, the Assault, another famous Dutch novel. Can you spot the human one again? Again, it's DeepL, Google, and a human translator competing.
Third one is human.
Yes, why? You immediately see it now.
Yeah.
Because the other two have translated the set of clauses in sequence,
Yes.
more or less. The third one, motorcycle sounded, is
So
literary.
Berman would be so happy because you immediately see that the human translator starts interfering. Far away the sound of motorcycles was approaching. Motorcycles sounded in the distance. Also, that of a car. He heard the noise of a car. And then they're rather close to each other. But then the human translator has deleted something. Where is it again?
That's the human translator added future.
Yes, future, added here. It doesn't say that in the Dutch. And there's a deletion. I should have used in the second sentence. Yeah, she controlled herself. So the mother says, yes, I will close the door, and then says she controlled herself. That's correct. This is wrong. The pronoun's wrong. It's about the mother. She controlled herself, which is very essential to the story. His mother is terrified. The Germans are coming. She has to control herself, but he realizes that she's on the verge of something bigger. And the human translator, for some mysterious reason, has just deleted the entire clause. It just says he could tell from her voice. It doesn't say she controlled, she restrained, she something herself.
Is the human translation British English or American English?
I don't remember.
It's used double quotes, whereas the computer
It might
Google
be
is American,
English.
right? The British English is double quotes, right?
Yeah.
The US English would have used mom, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think the mama is also quite strange. I don't remember how old the main character is, but I don't think he's a small boy.
But if it's a translator and a Dutch person say mama or mama?
Mama.
Mama. It's maybe trying to reflect
Yeah.
what we could say in Dutch.
It would have to be a really small child to say mama, I think.
No, some of us can say mama. Yeah, it's interesting. So one thing I would like to do now in the future is this. Test whether readers can reliably identify which one is an MT, which one is a student translator, and which one is a professional translator. Because I think that will help us identify the norms and the expectations actual readers use to judge translations. I don't know about all of your countries, but in the Netherlands, translations are frowned upon. The common response you get is you should read the original. So the assumption is translations are always bad. Literary translators always get it wrong. And having them explain, why do you think this is a translation, why do you think this is a machine translation, might be an interesting way to get at those evaluations. Why do they think something is a machine translation? And then for students, one option that they would really like to explore is it a possibility for me to do literary translation through a machine? Because it would speed up my work so much that I would have more time to do sketch engine analyses or W matrix analyses or other kinds of stylistic analyses, because the bulk of it would be fine. 70% of the novel might just be fine if I put it through DeepL. And that means I have more time to do stylistic research and contextual and background research and fix an already okay text. So the students are usually quite open to this idea. So these are some academic considerations. So do they struggle with the same metaphors or same stylistic features? Can we use student data to improve the machine data? Can we use the machines to improve the students' translations? I think, especially for non-literary genres, yes. Machine translations of news texts tend to be really helpful to students because the machine gets the right words and then they suddenly understand what the text is about. It's really an interesting exercise for them. And can we integrate machine translation back into the literary translators toolkit in an ethically responsible and an empowering way, so that literary translators don't feel that they're forced to do this, but that they actually want to do it because it helps them in a different way. Thank you.
Very much. Well, I think that was great. We've got a few minutes for questions, I guess. We are running a little bit late. So would anybody like to come in with a question?
I have a question. Before I start. Can I ask something and then
Yeah, maybe better. Yeah.
Was this a course, an undergraduate course format on literary translation with all those students?
So it's drawing on different courses. It's all from the MA. So I taught them metaphor translation in the translation studies course, and then they applied that in the literary translation course, and then they had to write a research report on literary machine translation for the tools course. So they were using the same field, same assignment for 3 different courses.
And they don't have a different education when they are trained to be literary translators? For example, understanding literariness and all the devices of the discourse in literature and all the stylistic features, so that they don't omit them?
They don't all have the same training. So some of them have done a BA English Linguistics, some have done a BA English Literature, some have done Dutch or General Linguistics, and some have done business or law or any kind of non-linguistic or literary program. So they have various backgrounds.
So do you find the ones who study literature have a different sensibility? That they're less likely to omit or adapt? No.
It's well, in the case of metaphor, it's usually the hardcore linguists that are most accurate. Our literary students have a tendency to rewrite things because they think I can say this better. I don't know if you recognize that tendency. They want to improve on the text, and sometimes they do that in strange ways. To us, strange ways.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Do you think that the strange ways that they do it in come from the fact that they're so immersed in English that they kind of lost their Dutch skills?
Yes.
I know that happened a lot with us.
So our most, I co-teach with another literary translator, and the most shocking thing to us was we were teaching the literary translation course, and it struck us that their Dutch vocabulary was quite limited. And they said, but Dutch isn't that creative. And we said, so what's the last Dutch novel that you've read? And almost all of them said, I haven't read a Dutch novel in at least 10 years. And it was shocking, because they're training to become literary translators into Dutch, but they don't read Dutch novels, so they have no acute sense of what Dutch in literary text looks like. They know Dutch, but not in literary text. They don't know what literary Dutch behaves like. And I think that's why they start rewriting, because they think, oh, this sounds archaic, or this sounds weird, or this sounds too formal.
And I think they need stylistic training there to kind of counter those standardization issues.
And isn't that a problem with hegemonic languages like English? Because, for example, I noticed that expressions from German are now ending up in English sports discourse because there are some very successful German football managers who use expressions in English which are transliterations of the equivalent German expression. But now I hear English sports journalists using those phrases as though they were standard English.
Yeah.
And of course, they are now becoming standard English.
Yeah.
So they say the team is in a good way.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds very unidiomatic, but it's becoming idiomatic English sports discourse.
The problem is that most Dutch people aren't that proud of the Dutch language and culture. So even in, I don't know if you've recognized this, but Dutch students tend to like English culture or American culture, British culture. It depends a bit on. Some students really prefer American culture. Some students really prefer British culture. But they like those cultures more than their own Dutch culture. They don't particularly like Dutch culture. And that feeds into literary translation.
What's your language of instruction?
Both English and Dutch. Yeah. Most Dutch academics don't publish in Dutch.
Yeah. Nobody would read it.
Nobody would read it, but nobody would also appreciate it if you wrote in Dutch.
Very rarely
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really good in machine translation. I only used to Google and know solutions. But you said that students say they like machine translation and it covered like 70% of their job. Does this really accelerate their work? I mean, is it reliable, all the solutions, or they have to double check everything?
You always have to double check everything. Because the mistakes the machines make are unpredictable, and they...
Are students aware of that?
Sorry?
The students, are they aware of these things?
In literature, they're usually quite good at spotting content errors and consistency errors, but for legal discourse, for instance, they very often don't see it because they don't have enough knowledge of the law. And then you get major translation errors that look fine because the English is fine. Grammatically speaking, there's nothing wrong, but in terms of fact and content, the translation is completely inaccurate.
Isn't that one of the problems of particularly of machine translation, because it looks more plausible?
Yes.
Because when statistical machine translation was wrong, it was really wrong. So you can tell.
Yes. Yes. Google often gets it right, and then if you fact check it, you think that's not what it said. It's but yeah, so it's reliable up to here, and then you really need a human head to do the thinking.
What I try and persuade my students, and I do think it's true, is that if you try and post-edit machine translation output as it is now, not just with literary text, but even with news text, you spend more time than you would if you just translated it with a dictionary. And you're going to miss things that look plausible.
Yeah. So if you do one particular type of text, and you can actually train your engine specifically on that type of text, then you can get really accurate results.
But you need an awful lot of data.
Yeah.
An awful lot. I know.
It's usually the companies, you work for such a company, that have really good machine translation engines, trained specifically for particular types of text. Yeah.
So just an estimate, when you're saying a lot of data, what are we talking about?
Millions and millions of words.
Last week I was working with a colleague in France, and we trained an NMT engine, I think on something like 100 million words. I think that's what, and it took 5 hours. And, the output still wasn't great. So, so NMT is even more than SMT. You really do need a lot of data.
And if the text don't vary between different texts, then you can just use a memory. Then you don't need a machine translation engine. You just put it through a translation memory, and it translates the text. So, for texts that don't vary,
you don't need it because you can use a memory rather than a machine. It's a different kind of machine.
One more question.
Yeah, you mentioned another program apart from Google Translate, but I didn't get the name.
DeepL.
Oh, DeepL.
And DeepL used to be far superior to Google, but I think Google is catching up quickly because they.
When you say used to be, you mean about 6 months ago?
Yes. No, a year ago. A year ago.
A whole year ago.
A whole year ago, you really saw a difference. I don't know if they're using the same algorithms or.
It's a different team, isn't it? DeepL is German people.
Google and what's the one Microsoft has? Bing translation. Yeah.
I think Google has been cleaning up because there used to be a lot of rubbish. And now.
Okay, we need another couple of minutes. Thank you very much for listening.